Mira, come here. Look at the water. It's ice. It's been ice since the last moon.
Under the ice, something moved.
That's a fish. A fish? Here? Yes, look!
There are dozens of them, moving together.
Right now, there is a lake sitting somewhere above 10,000 feet, locked in granite, fed only by snowmelt, with no river running into it and no river running out of it. It froze solid last winter. It will freeze solid again this winter, and in it, right this second, trout are swimming. You've probably driven past a lake like that, or hiked to one, or seen a photo of one on your phone this week without giving it a second thought. Maybe you even ate fish this month that came from water like that. But stop and actually look at the geometry of it. A bowl of water carved into rock. No connection to the ocean. No connection to any river system, sealed off in some cases for 10,000 years, and full of living, breeding, thriving fish. So how did they get there? By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how fish end up in mountain lakes, why the answer you've probably heard is almost entirely wrong, and what this whole strange question reveals about how life actually moves across a planet. Let's start with the obvious answer, because the obvious answer is the one nearly everyone reaches for first. They swam. Water flows downhill, so at some point there must have been a stream, a channel, a connection, and the fish just worked their way up it. And honestly, a lot of the time, that's correct. Fish are relentless upstream travelers. Brown trout in Norway have been documented climbing gradients that look, to a human eye, like waterfalls rather than rivers. A fish will spend weeks pushing against current for the sake of a few hundred meters of better spawning gravel. But here's the thing. That explanation collapses the moment you look at the specific lakes people actually ask about. Take the alpine lakes of California's Sierra Nevada. In 1996, a study by Roland Knapp of the University of California's Sierra Nevada Aquatic Research Laboratory documented something that had been quietly known among fisheries biologists for decades. Before the late 1800s, the overwhelming majority of high-elevation Sierra lakes, above roughly 9,000 feet, contained no fish at all. None. Zero. Glacial scouring had carved those basins, and the outlet streams below them dropped over cliffs and cascades that no fish could climb. They were beautiful, cold, and biologically empty. So where did the trout come from? Here's where it gets interesting, because the answer to the Sierra question isn't geology at all. It's people carrying buckets. In the 1870s and 1880s, sheep herders, miners, and early recreational anglers began packing live fish up into the high country in milk cans strapped to mules. The California Fish Commission formalized the practice, and by the mid-20th century, the state was dropping fingerling trout out of airplanes. Not a metaphor. Actual aircraft, flying low over the Sierra, releasing tens of thousands of baby trout into lakes that had never held a vertebrate in their entire existence. By the 1990s, Knapp surveys found that roughly 60% of those historically fishless lakes had established fish populations. Almost all of it was deliberate human stalking, carried out over about a century. Let that sink in. A huge fraction of the wild mountain lakes you've fished, photographed, or dreamed about are ecological installations. Someone put those fish there, recently, within the lifetime of your great-grandparents. Now, that's the myth handled, but it opens a much older question. Because humans have only been stalking mountain lakes for 150 years or so, and mountain lakes have held fish for far, far longer than that. The Andes, the Himalaya, the Alps, the Ethiopian highlands, all of them contain native fish species found nowhere else on Earth, species that evolved in isolation over hundreds of thousands of years. Nobody carried those up in a bucket. So the natural mechanisms have to be real, and they have to be good. The first and most important one is the one people forget because it operates on a timescale we're physically incapable of feeling. Mountains move, not sideways, particularly up. The Himalaya are rising roughly 5 millimeters a year as the Indian plate grinds into Asia. That sounds like nothing. Over 1 million years, it's 5 kilometers. Which means that a lake sitting at 4,000 meters today may have been a perfectly ordinary lowland pond, connected to a perfectly ordinary river system, back when the fish first colonized it. The fish didn't climb the mountain. The mountain climbed underneath the fish. Geologist Peter Molnar and his colleagues have spent decades documenting exactly this kind of uplift across the Tibetan Plateau, and the fish record backs it up beautifully. The schizothoracine fishes, snow trout of the Tibetan Plateau, are a textbook case. Genetic work published in the 2000s and 2010s traced their diversification directly to phases of plateau uplift, showing lineages splitting apart at the same moments the landscape was rising, and river systems were being severed. Those fish are essentially living altimeters. Their family tree is a record of a continent buckling. Think about that for a second. A trout whose ancestors never went anywhere, and yet ended up 3 miles above the sea. But uplift only explains lakes that were once low. It doesn't explain isolated basins that were carved fresh by glaciers drained and then somehow ended up populated. For that, we need the second mechanism, and it's the one that produces the most arguments on the internet. River capture. Rivers are not stable. They are constantly cutting backward into their own headwaters through a process geologists call headward erosion. When one river cuts back far enough, it can breach the divide separating it from a neighboring drainage and steal its flow. The technical term is stream piracy, which is an unusually honest name for a geological process. When that happens, two river systems that had been separated for 1,000,000 years are suddenly connected, and every fish in one has access to the other. The lake at the top of that captured drainage gets colonized in a single geological instant. The classic documented example is the Colorado River system, where work on the Grand Canyon's incision history, including studies through the 2000s using cosmogenic dating and the distribution of native fishes like the humpback chub and Colorado picamino, has repeatedly shown fish distributions that only make sense if drainages that are now separate were once joined. The fish are the evidence. Their genetics preserve a map of rivers that no longer exist. So we've got two mechanisms so far, and both of them are slow. Uplift takes millions of years. Capture takes hundreds of thousands. But there's a third route, and this one is fast, chaotic, and much stranger. Floods, not ordinary spring floods, catastrophic ones. During the end of the last ice age, roughly 15 to 13,000 years ago, the retreating ice sheets left behind enormous lakes dammed by ice and debris, and when those dams failed, they released volumes of water that are genuinely hard to hold in your head. Glacial Lake Missoula, in what's now Montana, drained repeatedly across eastern Washington in floods that geologist Harlen Bretz first described in the 1920s, and got mocked relentlessly for, incidentally, because the geological establishment of the time refused to believe in catastrophes. Bretz was finally vindicated decades later, and lived long enough to receive the Penrose Medal in 1979 at the age of 96. Vindication is nice. Vindication at 96 is a bit like getting your security deposit back in 2043. Those floods moved fish. They connected basins that had never been connected, dumped water and everything in it across watershed divides, and left populations stranded in newly formed lakes as the water drained away. Ice Age meltwater didn't just carve landscapes, it redistributed entire faunas. Now here's the part nobody talks about. Everything I've described so far still requires water to physically connect two places, even if only for an afternoon. But there are lakes that appear to have been colonized with no connection at all. And this is where the folklore comes in, because for centuries, people across Europe and Asia explained mountain fish with the same story. It rained them. And the frustrating thing is, that story is not entirely wrong. Waterspouts and tornadoes over water genuinely do lift fish, frogs, and other small aquatic animals into the air, and there are documented modern cases of fish falling from the sky. Honduras has an annual event locals call the Lluvia de Peces, and there are credible reports from Britain, India, and Australia. The problem is that a rain of fish deposits dead or dying adults, and a single event almost never delivers a breeding pair into suitable habitat at the same moment. As a colonization mechanism, it is real but statistically pathetic. It's a lottery ticket, not a strategy. But there's a related idea that's far more plausible, and it's the one that has quietly obsessed biologists since the 1800s: birds. Charles Darwin himself was fascinated by this problem. In On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, he described experiments where he suspended duck feet in aquaria to see what would cling to them, and he found freshwater snail eggs and other organisms hitchhiking successfully. He was explicitly trying to solve the puzzle of how isolated ponds get stocked. For more than a century after Darwin, the idea that fish eggs could survive a bird's digestive tract was treated as charming but unproven. Then in 2020, a team led by Adam Lovaskis at the Danube Research Institute in Hungary published results in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They fed carp eggs to mallards, and a small fraction, well under 1%, passed through alive and hatched. Under 1% sounds trivial, but run that against millions of ducks over thousands of years across every wetland on a continent, and a mechanism that fails 99.9% of the time becomes a mechanism that works constantly. Cold, isolation, and time. Those are the three forces that define a mountain lake, and life beat all three of them using a duck's gut. And this is where the question stops being about fish. Because what you're actually looking at when you stand at the edge of a high alpine lake is a demonstration of something much larger about how life behaves on this planet. We tend to imagine ecosystems as fixed, that things live where they live because that's where they belong. But nothing belongs anywhere. Every population on Earth is the result of an improbable arrival, a river that got stolen, a mountain that rose, a flood that shouldn't have happened, a duck that ate the wrong thing and flew north. Life does not colonize by planning, it colonizes by volume. It throws itself against impossible odds so many times that impossibility becomes a rounding error. The fish in that lake are not there because a fish decided to go there. They're there because, over 10,000 years, the universe rolled the dice enough times that a 1 in 10,000 event became a certainty. And humans for the last century and a half have been doing the same thing on purpose, with buckets, mules, and airplanes, and calling it management. We've become another dispersal mechanism, a very fast, very deliberate one, with consequences that scientists like Knapp have documented in detail. Introduced trout in the Sierra devastated native mountain yellow-legged frog populations because those frogs had evolved in lakes that never contained a predator. We didn't just add fish. We rewrote the rules of a place that had been running on different rules since the ice left. So let's put the whole thing in order. 50 million years ago, the Indian plate slams into Asia and starts pushing the Himalaya skyward, carrying lowland fish upward with it. Over the following tens of millions of years, uplift and river capture repeatedly sever and rejoin drainages worldwide, splitting fish lineages into isolated mountain populations. Around 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum locks the high country in ice and scours out the empty basins that will become alpine lakes. Between 15 and 13,000 years ago, catastrophic meltwater floods redistribute fish across watersheds that had never touched. For the 10,000 years after that, birds and storms keep quietly ferrying eggs into isolated water, one improbable success at a time. Then in the 1870s, humans start hauling trout uphill in cans. By the 1950s, we're dropping them from airplanes. And by 1996, Knapp surveys show 60% of naturally fishless Sierra lakes holding fish we put there. Every time you skip a stone across a lake, or watch a bird lift off a pond and disappear over a ridge, you are watching the exact mechanism that populated half the mountain water on Earth. Nothing about it looks like colonization. That's the point. The biggest journeys on this planet have always been made by things that had no idea they were traveling. Life doesn't find its way to the top of a mountain. It gets carried there by accident and then refuses to leave. If you'd been standing at the edge of one of those empty glacial lakes 10,000 years ago, would you have believed anything could ever live in it? Let me know in the comments.